I'm going to show you how to replace a front wheel bearing on an Astra H. To start with the wheel off and the car in the air, you can remove the axle nut at the end of the drive shaft with a 32mm socket if you have a powerful enough impact gun. I don't, so I had to reattach the wheel without the centre cap and drop the car back to the floor. I could then use a breaker bar to crack free and remove the axle nut. The car can then go back in the air and the wheel can come back off. We need to remove the brake hardware, starting with the caliper, which we can remove as a single piece by taking off the mounting bracket bolts with an 18mm socket. Once the caliper's off, make sure to rest it somewhere so that it isn't hanging by the brake line, which could damage it. Then we can remove the brake disc with a T30. Disconnect the wheel speed sensor here. You can see that my wheel speed sensor wire has actually been cut, which is why I'm doing this job. I have an ABS code for the wheel speed sensor. On these cars the drive shafts are prone to rusting, and then the jagged edges over time cut into the wires. Holding in the wheel bearing there are 3 Torx E18 bolts. The first one's here, the next one's here above the drive shaft and can be a bit tricky to get a socket on. The final bolt is here. It may be necessary to remove the track rod end so that you can swivel the hub to get better access for a ratchet. It isn't essential, but it might help. If you want to do this, you can remove the track rod by removing this nut here with a 19mm socket and then using a ball joint splitter on the ball joint above. Now we can start removing the bolts that are holding in the wheel bearing. They can be quite tricky to get a socket onto because of the position of the drive shaft. I'd actually recommend using a Torx E18 3/8 inch socket if you can find one, as I just found that the smaller size made it a bit easier to work with. Now the wheel bearing is free to come out, although it'll probably take a fair bit of persuasion with a hammer. Once it's out, I can pull it clear of the drive shaft, along with this very rusted remains of the dust shield. There's some kind of ring here at the back that's become rusted into the hub as well, so I've pulled that out. I'd recommend cleaning up the surface here with some sandpaper while you have the chance. To install the new wheel bearing, first feed through the wire, then line the bearing up with the bolts and push it in as far as you can. You get it in the rest of the way by fully tightening all the bolts down. It's really important to make sure that the new wheel bearing is sitting flush to the hub, otherwise when you try to rebuild the brakes they won't sit right and the mounting bracket will grind against the disc. This is nowhere near as simple as I initially thought it was going to be. I've put the new wheel bearing in and then the caliper mounting bracket wasn't sitting flush, and after a little while I realised that the disc was off centre because the new bearing wasn't flush, so I've had to take out these 2 bolts on the sides several times and tighten them back down until I could find a way that has got it flush. So in the end the top bolt went in first and that got flush, then the left one all the way until the bearing's sitting flush, and then the one on the right, and then finally once it's all flush the mounting bracket lines up without scraping against the disc. Moral of the story is, make sure you get the wheel bearing in right the first time to avoid yourself any unnecessary trouble. Assuming you've done that, we can now move on and reconnect the new wheel speed sensor. Make sure to position it in such a way that it's not going to rub against the drive shaft. I'm going to take a break at this point to jump inside the car and check my diagnostic tool. As you can see, it's pulling an ABS fault, which is why I've been doing this job in the first place. but with the new wheel speed sensor connected, when I clear the codes and run the report again, the code doesn't return. And the ABS light is now gone. Now that the ABS code is gone, we can proceed. We can start by reattaching the track rod, slide the stud into the hub, then tighten the nut. Torque that to 60 Newton meters. Torque the wheel bearing bolts to 90 Newton meters. For these bolts there's actually a 3-stage torquing process. Once you've applied the initial torque, we then need to tighten them by a further 30 degrees, then an additional 15 degrees. Now we can rebuild the brakes. Put the brake disc back on and tighten it down with a T30 fixing screw. Then get the caliper back into place and tighten it down using the caliper mounting bracket bolts, which we then torque to 90 Newton meters. Now we need to reinstall the wheel, but with the centre cap still missing. Lower the car so that all 4 wheels are on the ground. Install the new axle nut that should come with your wheel bearing kit. This also has a 3-stage torque process. First, torque it to 150 Newton meters. Then slack it off by 90 degrees. Finally, torque it to 250 Newton meters. My torque wrench only goes to 210, so I torqued it that far and then tightened it as far as I could with a breaker bar. The wheel bolts can be torqued to 110 Newton meters in a crisscross pattern. Now we have a new front wheel bearing on an Astra H and we've got rid of our ABS light.